In what way are the changes that you went through at IBM similar to the kind of situation that governments face today?
Well, I think while the object of work, the tasks that government performs are demonstrably different from what IBM engages in, a lot of the lessons that we learned in the changes we've been through are quite germane. I think the need to syndicate, the importance of change and to communicate that around the organization, the need to get folks on board with the imperative of change is quite comparable. In a lot of ways, the complexity of IBM and all of its divisions and our instantiations around the world and so forth is similar to some of the complexity that government finds with all the agencies and so forth. So I think there are parallels and certainly some lessons that can be learned from the changes that IBM has been through.
So let's speak to some of them. I loved your first one about starting a movement, but it strikes me that you can start a movement based on a crisis, or you can start a movement based on the desired outcome. Is there a link, or am I mixing two ideas there?
No, I think either can be the motive force. One of my colleagues, Linda Sanford, who has run transformation in IT and IBM for some time, likes to use this phraseology around starting a movement. And it really was fundamental to getting that momentum that we needed in IBM to really get things moving. At some level, everybody knew we had some challenges. Everybody knows that we continue to have challenges, but the level of buy-in on the part of folks all up and down the organization, because this really has to happen at multiple levels, is a very important characteristic of what it takes to get things going. I think having that kind of communications and syndication of the problem statement, a common view of what we're trying to achieve, and then some small wins along the way, because you really do need to have some victories that can give folks the encouragement that it isn't just here's a future state 5 years on, but here are the beginning pieces on the journey to that future state.
I bet you everyone in government is going through an exercise now of what's core and what's non-core. Mm-hmm. You have suggested, though, that isn't the right question.
Well, I think it's a useful framework, but only to a point, and I think it's beginning to run its course. Core, non-core sort of implies important and not important. And I think in many cases, firms and governments have stopped doing the things that truly don't matter. Now, maybe there's some vestige left around, things that we can really stop. But the question of how you do shared services and in which cases you do outsourcing to partners, I think does have a lot more to do with finding those places where you can differentiate and truly make a difference than it does with finding the things that aren't important. And so I think core non-core comes with a certain amount of semantic baggage and kind of a set of connotations that aren't that helpful to us these days.
So the notion is really proving why you're unique, right?
I think so. I think if you have the sort of deliberate analysis of where you provide unique value, what it is that you do that differentiates you, that only you can do, then you're on the right set of things when you get into this conversation about for instance, outsourcing and partnering. On the question of shared services, which I think is a big part of the opportunity in the public sector space, and certainly a big part of the IBM story, there the question has to do with which things are common, or should be done in a common way, and which things really are unique. And so, again, it changes the logic a bit. In the corporate world, we used to ask about centralized, decentralized, or corporate and divisional. In government, it might have been what's done federal, what's done provincial, what's done local, or what's done at the top of the house in a province, what's done in various lower level agencies and departments. And that question is inherently political as to where you put it. If you can move the discussion towards the nature of the work and whether the work is really something that can only be done uniquely versus something that can be done in a common way, I think we're on a much more useful dimension.
And I read that IBM, when they did some consolidation of these kind of things through presumably shared services, you went from something like 123 CIOs to one. I mean, it was an extraordinary drop.
Yeah, if you go back some years to when our two ago CEO Lou Gerstner showed up, one of the stories would be that when he asked to meet the CIO, 120 some people put their hand up. There were a lot of folks who had that function, and indeed in those days we had an awful lot of unique implementation happening pretty far out in the field and in the plants and in the various divisions and so forth. In many cases, it would fail that test I mentioned of correctly sorting out which things could be done in a common way and which things needed to be unique. In other words, way too many things were on that list that would purportedly be unique, when in fact they could be done in a common way to benefit the whole firm. And a big part of our change over the years has been this aggregation into a shared service where much more of the work is done one way across all of IBM, across all the countries, across all the product groups, across all the client sets.
Shared Services Canada is trying to do that at the federal level.
Sure.
And I'm not going to say there's lots of resistance, but there is a challenge. I mean, this is a culture change for the individual CIOs and departments to now be part or feeding into a larger corporate.
No doubt about it.
project.
And yet, I think it would be difficult to construct a good argument for why not on a few of those dimensions. I know I've met some of the folks there, and I think there's a thoughtful approach to the remit. In other words, let's go back and pick some wins. It's hard to argue you need your own email a whole bunch of different places, right? And so a common system for that seems like a great place to start. I know that's one of the things that they've got on the list. There will be many others, and again, I think that the trick is to change the burden of proof. If a given subunit can prove why they really are unique, then that's great, and it's appropriate to have the thing done in a more local kind of way. But the default value needs to be that we could do it in one way and do it in a common way. And I think that's the change in mentality. It doesn't answer every question differently, but I think over time it'll answer quite a few of the questions differently.
And you have to get the balance right. I'm thinking UK tried to do this with procurement, centralized procurement, but then they allowed too many one-offs, departments who didn't have to be part of it. And so I was reading that the savings are not as great as they would like.
So you
got to get that balance right.
In general, I mean, all these pendulums can move pretty freely. I think it's better to move most of the way and then be very consistent about the implementation, ruthless about the consistency, than it is to try to do it in some more perfect way, but then have a lot of exceptions, because in fact that's less effective and gives a very mixed message. So it would be better to go moderately or substantially towards what you think the ideal state is, and then be very exacting about the compliance and the requirement to really get on board.
Your story about being data-driven, I could see every public servant in the room rolling their eyes, because that is the issue. How you get good performance data, how do you get data that, as you said earlier, you're not fighting over, and
right.
You've got to get to that stage. Very hard, I think.
It's a challenge. Well, and talented people can derail the meeting, and a lot of meetings can degrade from the discussion of the real situation to a collection of anecdotes, and the best storyteller wins in some of those cases. And so it's important, if you want to affect real change, to get to one view of the truth. If you can get to what everyone agrees is the format and the periodicity of reporting and the manner in which it's going to be displayed and so forth, you can then start to have substantive business discussions. If the first way out of the room when the meeting starts is to say, I don't agree with that, or I think that's last week's data, or we don't count it that way, or you forgot to consider this wrinkle, then it's very hard to get any real progress.
In the question of leadership, Gerstner has a sort of a mythical reputation. Is it hard to maintain the momentum of change as the leadership changes?
Well, it's interesting. If it's a campaign that has sort of a fixed end to it, and at the end folks can say, okay, we got that done, now we're done, there's a real problem. If you look at IBM, a lot of this stuff, you're quite correct, Gerstner started. Sam Palmisano, the next CEO, continued. Ginny Rometty, our current CEO, continues to continue those. And what has happened is a change in our mentality towards the notion that this is going to be continuous improvement. And that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it takes a different headset. You've got to come to work with the notion that not moving, not changing, and allowing complacency to creep in is a real danger. And that we've got to be on patrol all the time to find the next set of changes that are required to be most competitive in the marketplace, do the best job for our multiple constituencies, our clients, our shareholders, our employees. And I think we've effected that change. We've gone around the corner to where that's always part of the agenda. It isn't something where you race through a 1,500-meter run and then you collapse at the tape and say, boy, I'm glad we averted a crisis, because challenges keep coming. Clearly, some of that maps to public sector, some of it maps less well, but ultimately, as Don Drummond points out, the governments, in fact, do have shareholders, citizens, and if we do the right job of informing them of what we're trying to do, I think a lot of these parallels will hold out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.